I'm going to do a bit of an introduction up front first, then I'm going to hand over to our Technical Working Group Lead Specialist, John Matthews, who is the person who's done most of the work in bringing together ideas, approaches and science views from various members of the Technical Working Group and, of course, from the literature in the general community. John is from the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation. First, just to kick us off, welcome everyone to this workshop, which is about our climate bonds proposed water standard, defining expectations for water-related green bonds in a dynamic climate. This project is a collaboration between a number of entities to try and develop criteria which could be used to better define assets and projects in the water-related space suitable for green bond issuance and climate bond issuance to back or be used, or where the proceeds of green bonds or climate bonds may be applied. The coalition is between Ceres. Monica Freeman from Ceres is on the line representing Ceres here. Say hi, Monica.
Hello, everybody.
Thank you. That's just the voice from Vancouver. World Resources Institute, which most of you will probably recognise as a leading institute in the area of sustainability and resource management and climate change, based in Washington, D.C. CDP, formerly known as the Carbon Disclosure Project, who has been involved in the climate bonds governance from day one. And then we have John Matthews from the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation as our lead specialist. The green bond market is one that's exploded over the last few years. It's gone from 3 billion a year issuance to 11 billion a year, then 37 last year. And this year, we will be somewhere between 40 and 60 billion of issuance. A bit hard to tell at this stage. We're only at about 26 billion, which is a lot lower than we had expected for the year, but there's quite a lot of issuance we know coming through in the lead up of COP, plus China's entering the market in a couple of weeks' time, so we'll see a lot now. The question is where we will get to. The market is certainly on an upward movement. We have an awful lot of pipeline information for issuance in the coming year. So it's a growth market. But as it's a growth market, there is more and more investigation of the underlying green credentials of some of these bonds by the investor groups that have been involved in this topic in the past. Institutional investors have driven this market. Insurance funds, especially, and pension funds have been very keen on the idea of getting access to fixed income investments that, as a bonus feature, address their long-term or macro concerns around climate risk. And that's essentially what's allowed this market to grow. A very interesting point to note about that. The background to this really is probably best stated or just best described as the $43 trillion of assets under management represented in climate change statements at the last UN Climate Summit in September of last year, where member associations, including Ceres, which was the leader of that group, issued statements about the importance of addressing climate change, the importance of governments acting, and also their willingness to invest in climate solutions. In fact, the insurance industry went one step further and announced that they would multiply by 10 their climate-related investments by 2010. That's really underpinning this particular chart. It's important to note it's a range of different sorts of issuance. In the water area, the bulk of issuance has been related to municipal bonds so far, but we're beginning to see other sorts of bonds. There are certainly hydro in the corporate area. It's been coming through, and in the development bank area. What started as a development bank story has now morphed into a corporate story as well. The basics of this market are proceeds go to green. Any kind of entity can theoretically issue as long as there is comfort about the use of proceeds. That means reporting and transparency to underlying assets. Refinance can be used as projects, so an asset-backed securitization of solar rooftop leases is a refinancing of those rooftop leases, and that applies in other sectors as well. And we've seen issuance from a variety of sorts of bodies. The proceeds have, in this particular labelled green bond market, mostly energy, 38% so far, but with the buildings industry growing quickly behind it. Water's only been about 9.7% so far. This is an area where independent reviews have become established as the dominant form. In fact, even in the no part of this particular chart you see on your screen, the bulk of bonds reference something like the US Green Building Council's lead criteria or other forms of criteria. So in effect, it's still an independent review. But the idea of getting a bespoke independent review or a certification under a climate bond certification has now been pretty well established in the market in the European area and in other countries. In the muni area, this is growing. We've seen a couple of municipal issuers in the US now get independent reviews. We expect that to grow this year, particularly as criteria become clearer and simpler to understand. And this underlines the work of the water group here. Bond markets grow rapidly when things are standardized and clear, and that's the rationale behind trying to develop clear criteria and clear certification schemes. I've already covered these particular points, but the main point to note here is that proxies are something we're looking for in every sector. So whether it be building codes or bioenergy, we are looking for existing schemes rather than try and invent the wheel. Whether that's possible in water or not, we will see. The certification scheme itself is backed by investors representing, or investor associations and investors representing $34 trillion of assets under management, and a couple of key NGOs, NRDC and CDP, as well as, by the way, the State Treasurer of California sits on that board, and CalSTRS, the California Teachers Retirement System. There are a number of layers of key working groups with the standards board at the top. There are specialist industry working groups, and then most importantly, there are specialist technical working groups. There are about 120 organisations internationally involved in the various industry working groups. Some involved in the water, things like DC Water or Seattle Public Utilities. We have a broad-based approach to bringing in the strongest domain experts in each particular sector that's being looked at, whether it be transport or agriculture and forestry, or of course water. The idea for this is that water characteristics or criteria sit within a broad group of domain-specific sets of criteria. There will be metrics that are specific to different domains to ascertain whether assets are eligible to be used or not. In the Climate Bonds version 2, which is in the process of being rolled out, we're providing fairly detailed guidance and a checklist approach for issuers and the verifiers of issuers to consider. Our focus is here, or our objective here, is to reduce the cost of transaction within the bounds of ensuring trust around the robustness of the green credentials. In a bond market, having a low cost of transaction is going to be a very important part of making sure this market is quickly scalable across a variety of sectors. But as I said, it's very important that we maintain absolute trust in the environmental credentials of these assets at the same time. And we'll hear more about that from John in a minute. Certification is a relatively straightforward process. When the criteria are available and are available as a public good that anyone can interrogate and review on the website, it then comes down to the hiring of an approved verifier to confirm that the credentials of the bond are in line with the climate bond standard. Once the verification report comes in, the issuer decides to apply to certification on the basis of that verification report. Bingo, a climate bond or a certified climate bond can be issued. That can be a very quick process if the issuer's tracking of assets and appropriate understanding of criteria are on display for a verifier, or it can be a long process if work has to be done to get those aspects of the bond in place. I'm now going to cut across to the important part of this particular presentation and bring John Matthews in to talk about proposed criteria. Over to you, John.
All right, thank you so much, Sean. My name's John Matthews. I work as the Secretary Coordinator for the Alliance for Global Water Adaptation, AGWA, which is an organization that is co-chaired by the World Bank and the Stockholm International Water Institute, CWI. I wanted to start off making three kind of background points. One is, why is AGWA involved in this process? AGWA is a global network of individuals and institutions that are working on how to operationalize and mainstream insights from climate adaptation into water management. Katie, it seems like there's a lot of background noise.
Can I just ask everyone to confirm going on mute while the talks, just in case there's any background noise coming in that way? Thank you very much.
Thanks so much. So AGWA is very much involved in the process of gathering, synthesizing, and reporting out the kind of growing area of expertise and knowledge that's around how we mainstream climate adaptation into water management. AGWA members have been deeply involved in this process. I got involved about a year ago, and the 40 or so people that have been in the working groups, at least 20 have been involved in AGWA, and from our network, including from our steering committee, and AGWA is committed to the next stage as well. We even have some expert groups that are forming in advance, in which AGWA members are taking very direct roles. My own background is I'm an aquatic ecologist, but I work in both a variety of disciplines and in policy areas. And my particular role in this project has been to sit between the other consortium members that Sean mentioned, and also the different working group members. So I am trying to gather these ideas, ask questions, guide some of the direct aspects of the process. But it would be a mistake to put too much emphasis on my own contribution. I feel like it's more important to really be able to say that this is largely a consensus-driven process with a variety of experts from around the world. Most of our conference calls for the various working groups involved at least 3 continents at a time. So we've tried to have a good selection of people that we thought would be able to contribute, both from the climate communities, the water community, and the finance community. Lastly, I note just from glancing at the list of attendees that there are a number of people that saw us in an earlier version of this presentation in Stockholm during World Water Week. And this is a shorter version of that talk. There are relatively few differences from it, but we hope that perhaps this serves as a better vehicle and platform for being able to ask more questions. We ran a little bit long, I think, in our presentation there to be able to solicit more audience feedback. So with that, I'd like to start off by saying how is it that we've decided to really focus on the climate part of thinking around water investments. And there are a number of good reasons. One is the real growth in the amount of money that's flowing into this area. That's climate related, especially on the climate mitigation side, the green energy side, but there's also an rapidly increasing amount of money that's going on the climate adaptation side. But maybe the most important reason is really that the climate change itself as a process is rapidly developing. The water cycle is extremely sensitive to climate change, and it makes the kinds of investments that are typically made through climate bonds or through green bonds really exposed to climate risk. And in our analysis, there was very little that had been placed already in the bonds market that could be a good, accurate, relatively quick assessment for being able to think about that climate risk. So it was unknown in the sense that many people were aware that this was a problem, but it was very difficult to be able to evaluate how much of a problem it was and if it had been properly addressed through a particular offering. So when we think about the climate part of water investments, because of historic policy reasons, we have typically had two main ways of grouping our work around climate mitigation, about greenhouse gases, atmospheric carbon emissions, and so on, and climate adaptation, how we think about impacts from climate change we've already seen or that we think might be happening in the future. And there are very basic differences between those two areas. On the climate mitigation side, we have very sophisticated understanding. People know what we're talking about. We have really good ways of being able to evaluate it. Many of them represent something comparable to a best practices. They're often very not just sector specific, but subsector specific in many cases. It's really something that we can evaluate in a standard way. On the climate adaptation side, however, almost everything I just said is not true. It tends to be highly contextual. There are very few best practices. There are relatively weak, often highly divisive technical standards, and many parts of the climate, water, and finance communities don't really understand adaptation or the need for adaptation as a risk. When is it important? How do we address it? So given that, with this approach, with this draft standard, we tried to take some really bold ideas that have been developing globally. And in that sense, I think this is a very edgy standard. The first is that because there's no single widely agreed upon methodology for doing adaptation, we have what we think are broad character traits that are part of any good adaptation, vulnerability assessment or adaptation plan. But we also ask that people really show their analysis. So we try to be, we call upon people to be transparent so that if there are investors that need to go into more detail than they can. We also think that in order for this to really be relevant, to get a strong uptake from the water community in particular, that we need to integrate with decision-making processes. So taking an idea that was developed fairly recently with the World Bank with many of their water investments, we've taken, we've married a kind of checklist, which is easy for scoring, with a decision tree approach, so that water managers can use the standard as really a kind of ongoing method for assessing their work and implementation into the future. We think that mitigation and adaptation are deeply integrated as well. The little picture here is from the Hoover Dam, obviously a hydropower facility, also designed for flood control and water supply, built about 85 years ago. And that little white mark that's around the edges of the reservoir is about 35 meters high today. That's represents the gap between what that facility was designed for and how much water really exists in that system. That facility is in dire risk of actually having the reservoir levels drop very soon below the intake tunnels for the hydropower. And it recently required a $1.5 billion investment for a new water supply for the city of Las Vegas. In that sense, mitigation and adaptation are deeply integrated, that if we don't think about how to adapt our mitigation and we don't think about the mitigation implications of our adaptation, we may be not achieving long-term sustainability goals. And that's something that we really want to change with this standard. The mitigation target scoring, as I suggested earlier, is really connecting to external reference methods. No need for us to reinvent the wheels that have already been well-honed and are well-maintained by groups such as the UNFCCC, US EPA, the EU, and others. On the adaptation side, we really focus on transparency and evidence. And we also do not assume that climate change will actually have an impact. It's okay if you say, in effect, based on our analysis, that our project is independent of climate. This is a very busy figure. Normally when we show it, it has animation. It does not right now, but I'll talk you through it, and it should be relatively clear. If we start on the left side of the diagram, we see a bar that goes from blue to red purple in the middle. And that represents simply the starting place for a particular project, defining a project as climate adaptation or climate mitigation, or some that could be on either side. So climate mitigation, these tend to be energy efficiency, energy generation projects. On the climate adaptation side, these are typically projects that are for storage, water storage. They could be for dealing with stormwater issues, flood control, and also ecological restoration, an issue that has already been raised by Eric, and how we think about the integration of ecosystems within infrastructure networks. Agriculture and navigation issues, sometimes they are viewed more in the adaptation side, sometimes in the mitigation side, but it doesn't really matter. This left-hand side is really just where you start into the decision tree. Let's say if we are beginning with a hydropower project, say, so we're in the mitigation side. If you follow the arrow down, you will develop a climate mitigation score, which has two major components. The first one is, what is the carbon baseline? And what are the state of emissions already that we're thinking about in terms of the energy grid, this particular facility, if it's a reoperated facility, and then what are the carbon benefits? This is second score. So what is it that we are estimating are going to be the shifts that are occurring with carbon deferrals, avoidance, and so on. For many mitigation projects, we also think that it's important to have a climate adaptation score as well. Hydropower is a very good example in which you probably need to also have a climate mitigation score. And that really falls into a very standard international methodology of combining a vulnerability assessment, is climate relevant or important, and second, an adaptation plan that is keyed very directly to that vulnerability assessment. So if climate is relevant, how can we ensure that we are flexible and resilient? A couple of the key points to note on the adaptation plan is that we really divide that into some of the both the ecological, hydrological, structural issues. So thinking very much about what's happening in the system with the water, how we're going to address those changes, but also trying to think about both allocation and governance. Water allocation is how water is divided among different users in a subbasin or a basin. Governance is how we resolve conflict, how we negotiate, and in the adaptation community, in the climate change community, it is very widely recognized that both of these aspects are really critical in order to, in effect, serve as a proxy for flexibility, for the dealing with the unknown, with uncertainty in the future. So if we have a robust system, then it probably has also a robust allocation system and a robust governance system. So there are parts of the checklist that go down to that level. In terms of the vulnerability assessment, since this is a little bit less familiar, I thought I might go into a bit more detail. For new projects, there's some differences between rehabilitated or reoperated projects. For new projects, you're really trying to think about a current assessment. What are the existing ecological characteristics, and how will these change in the future? So trying to be somewhat more dynamic. And for rehabilitated projects, we also try to go to the extra level. Can we say that there are lost hydrological or ecological functions that could be restored? Does the asset currently match its existing climate? And then how will those impacts also shift over its operational lifetime? We try to separate out known existing climate impacts from potential future impacts. In terms of the adaptation plan, I've already talked about the combination of flexibility as well as thinking about current and future impacts. And maybe on the fourth item in this list, a big point that we really wanted to emphasize is if we're really thinking about sustainability, we need to at least be thinking about the operational lifetime of the asset, not just the finance term, not just for the length of the bond itself. Although some bonds have gone to much longer periods in order to be able to reflect and make more explicit. I see that there's a question from Corinne. Shouldn't mitigation projects also be run through the vulnerability assessment? Absolutely. Yeah, that's very much a part of the system. We have a table that's as part of the draft standard that says which types of mitigation projects should be run through the adaptation side as well, so that they receive a total of 4 scores for both mitigation and adaptation theme. Some projects, say an ecological restoration or a stormwater project, probably, unless it involves pumping of the stormwater, it probably doesn't need a mitigation score. Certainly not if there are no mitigation claims that are made. So it's possible that a mitigation project, most mitigation projects will receive both a mitigation score and an adaptation score. Many projects that are just adaptation projects will only receive that score. The last couple of slides here, a case study from North America with a large public utility. This was issued about a year ago, about $350 million US, sold very, very rapidly, very high profile. And the aim of the project was to be able to separate the sanitary and stormwater systems to reduce flood risks for several neighborhoods in one of the cities that was served by the utility, and explicitly to improve water quality for regional riparian and estuarine ecosystems. This, because of that mix, it's very much on the adaptation side. Interestingly, although this is a very well-regarded utility, the offering memorandum was quite rich in detail about the fiduciary risks and the management system for the utility itself, but it actually had very little that was talking about climate change and the climate risks. And we felt like that was an interesting gap, so especially given the reputation of this particular utility. As a result, I reached out to the CFO directly. Even though there were some climate adaptation claims that were made, there was very little that was justified in the 85-odd pages. And the CFO got back to me within an hour or so and said that he wasn't sure if there had been a vulnerability assessment made or an adaptation plan. And I said, you know, my hunch is that your utility, like most utilities, like most engineered infrastructure projects over the past 7-8 years, there's probably been an explicit consideration of potential climate risks and how to formally work around those risks. That you probably have already done all of the work. Can you just check with your engineering department? He got back to me very rapidly, same day, and said, John, you were right. Actually, our engineering department, in cooperation with some other agencies in the city, have already developed an explicit vulnerability assessment and had developed an adaptation plan in response to that, and he was able to share that with me. He said, I actually feel like you have shown me that we need to really be including this material in our future bond memoranda in the future. So given that additional information that he was able to provide, of course, there's no mitigation score for either the project-related emissions or the emissions of reduction avoidance. But in the vulnerability assessment, definitely scored as superior, and the adaptation plan on all aspects showed up as superior. So hopefully at this point, we can take some questions. I'm sure that you all have a lot of them.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Very well.
Go ahead.
John, it's Diego.
Oh, hey, Diego. Hey, man.
Yeah. Hi, how are you?
Good.
It's Diego from the World Bank. I had many thanks for the presentation, John, and I tried to jump in first because I have to leave in a bit for the airport, to the airport. I had a couple of questions on a couple of things that you mentioned. First, you mentioned the issue of the advances that have been made on the mitigation side as part of these processes, and this is more of a personal opinion that I think that based on some of the recent work that we've done as part of the decision tree for the energy sector, you also see that on the mitigation side, there are many weaknesses in the way they address the sustainability of many of the mitigation actions, right? When it comes to the water side or to the water resources side. So I think that, you know, it's fair to say that the mitigation agenda is much more advanced, or the tools and the process are much more advanced on the adaptation side, but we also found that many of the mitigation plans that are being drafted primarily as it pertains to emission targets are not sustainable when it comes to the water resources side. No? So I think maybe that's something important to keep in mind. I saw also that there's a lot of emphasis on for the standards on the eco-hydrological conditions, and I wonder whether there was any thinking or the terms of reference contemplate the issue also of the social impacts. I mean, at the end of the day, we do a lot of this lending, and we package a lot of these lendings even for bonds, certification and issuance, with an outcome that is also has to do with social sustainability and ensuring that whatever infrastructure we build is built to provide a service, and the service does not impact negatively different social sectors. So I was wondering if there was any thought given to the social dimension as part of the discussions. And then my third point was that it seems that there's a lot of emphasis on identifying the vulnerabilities, which is fine, and that's part of the work that we do on the decision tree. But there is a lot of emphasis on having an adaptation plan. And my question is, in reality, I mean, what is an adaptation plan? Because we struggle in water with that question. Many of the actions that you end up taking on the adaptation side are things that should be part also of, you know, good, solid water resources management planning. What differentiates an adaptation plan for a strong water resources management assessment and analysis, and what it actually means that, you know, under what conditions do I need to go to an adaptation plan to get the certification? I mean, certain actions may not merit a full adaptation plan in order to make the investment you know, sustainable. And I stop there because I don't want to, you know, monopolize the discussion. Thanks.
Thank you, Diego. Those are very good questions. So there's really two questions, if I got it right. The first one is why not very much on the social dimensions, and the second one is what does an adaptation plan look like in the context of this standard? Is that right?
Yes.
Okay, great. So we had a long series of discussions about social dimensions in particular, and should they be a part of this standard, or is it something that should we draw it inside the box or not? And these were discussions that came up with both our technical working group, so people that tended to have a strong kind of technical background and technical expertise, as well as our industry working group, people that either have issued green bonds in the past or might do so again in the future, and so they have a somewhat different relationship with these institutionally. They tend to be much more focused on the kind of operational aspects. And in both cases, we received 100% consensus, so far at least, that we really need to make sure that the the niche for this standard is very clear, and that there were a number of areas, social dimensions included, that were considered to be, that they were covered by other kinds of standards, and that we probably should not move into that. Now, I can potentially, speaking in a purely speculative way, I could imagine that we could think about some adaptation components about social dimensions. But at least so far, it has been felt that there were other areas that could be standards that were already in place, that were operational and widely being used. That it made sense for us not to go into that area, at least as of yet. We are opening up to public commentary for the standard very soon, and I think at that point it would also be worthwhile to revisit the issue. Does that answer your first question?
Yes, thanks. And I think that it would make sense then to probably, as part of the standards, to cross-reference to some of the other standards or approaches that you mentioned, because I think that at the end of the day, even when you build, I mean, if you build a solid adaptation plan, you're trying to make sure that certain measures include some resilience aspect that at the end are taken by the social groups, no, by the users and the potential social vulnerable communities, right?
That's right.
Diego, this is Monica. If I could jump in, this is Monica from Ceres, and part of our thinking and what we're looking to evolve is, just that sort of a reference document that points to other good work in this area around social sustainability, around the human right to water or, resettlement issues. So it won't be embedded within the standard, but it will be this reference document for investors to then look at kind of what standards are in place and what they can use as guidelines to mitigate social impacts. So happy to talk to you about that further as well.
A parallel, Sean Kidney from Climate Bonds here, would be in the broader version 2 of the Climate Bond Standard. We ask people to disclose other standards or criteria that they are consistent with. We don't make it a mandatory part of the Climate Bonds certification. We ask for disclosure where we can. And I think the likely direction, but I don't want to speak on behalf of the group or the process because we've got a 2-month consultation process coming out, is that, but the likely thing is we would adopt a similar process rather than trying to make mandatory criteria that we're not 100% au fait with, or more to the point, not 100% looking at with our climate change lens. I appreciate it's difficult for water investments because there are so many aspects, taking hydro in Brazil, for example, that can be relevant. But as John says, the focus of what we've done here is to look at the gaps, and the gaps at this stage are climate change related criteria. Investors will make their own judgment based on being informed, and we can encourage them to be informed about other criteria or other proxies that already exist in the market. But it is challenging, as you know. You've done this at the World Bank for years, trying to cover everything in a criteria. It's a big job. We've tried not to take on the biggest job of all along those lines. Not so far, anyway.
So, thank you very much, Monica and Sean. Your second question, Diego, and I see Yopa's question here too. I'll get to that in a moment. Your second question, Diego, was really about the adaptation plan, and we've tried. Of course, the adaptation plan is a big phrase. It's an almost infinitely variable phrase if you really look at how the climate community treats an adaptation plan, and we've tried to define it fairly narrowly for this standard. We've tried to define it almost in a kind of UN sense, UNFCCC sense, that or the way that a lot of overseas development aid works, we tried to define the adaptation plan directly in response to the vulnerability assessment. So, the output from the vulnerability assessment should be a list of realized or potential impacts. The adaptation plan should really be what are the responses that we're going to be using in regard to those impacts. And we are really trying to encapsulate what I think of as the often highly localized decision-making context in which people develop an adaptation plan. That there are trade-offs that, you know, a hydro project for Peru versus a hydro project in Colombia, very similar characteristics, potentially very similar impacts. They might come up with very, very different kinds of responses. So that it's harder to say that there's a kind of uniform set of adaptation responses that people should be taking. So hopefully that's a fair response. Does that make sense, Diego?
Yeah, no, of course it makes sense, and obviously it's very context specific. I was just wondering, and maybe it's part of the documentation that you're preparing. I mean, to what extent, ideally you have a set of, you assess the vulnerabilities, and out of the vulnerabilities you will have a series of actions that can be taken to address sort of known risks, and then you may have a series of unknown risks or uncertainties that you need to address also in the future as part of your some of the measures that you may include. And then the question becomes, you know, again, and what I think what Sin was saying is, you know, how do you narrow down the scope of analysis, not to make it impossible, or, you know, for a certification process to go through, because you are adding so many layers and requirements to what the adaptation plan may consist of, that you cannot address everything. So in a sense, it's an issue of, what are the key elements that you know that should be part of the vulnerability assessment, and the type of response and quality of that response that you may need to be able to proceed with the process. No?
That's right. A lot of the burden for this really falls more on the vulnerability side. So, for instance, we think that a water-related project that doesn't have a strong hydrological model that's been developed, and we even go to the level of saying that these are some of the types of hydrological models that represent a global standard, that they are effectively the kind of normal standard that you see in engineered projects. That doesn't exist, then the project will score lower. We also, if you've done, in a sense, if you've done some of that good work, also if you've you know, not just used climate models for your climate information, you've also tried to draw from other types of information, such as paleo data. That you're casting a larger net, that hopefully you're being able to encapsulate a broader set of potential impacts in particular.
Yeah. Okay.
Good. I noticed. Go ahead.
No. Thanks.
Okay. Good. I note my friend Yopa's question. The analysis is good, but can you elaborate a bit more on how this is linked to the overall process? That is to say, who will decide that a water mitigation adaptation assessment is required to get the green bond status? And some of this may be a question that Sean can also reflect on a bit in terms of the overall evaluation process. What I will say is that we've tried to more narrowly in the context of this standard, if someone is seeking status, then we tried to make it as explicit as possible if what types of scores that you need to have. Mitigation only, mitigation and adaptation, or adaptation only, and we've also tried both with the technical and the industry working groups to ensure that that this is something that is in fact scorable and implementable. So for instance, a colleague with a global consulting firm that's on the technical working group. He oversees their water-related projects, and we asked him very, very frankly at various stages of this process, is this something that you can really score in your system? Do you feel any hesitation about it? And he said, absolutely not. He said, typically these are, in our case, these are many of the questions that we would be worried about anyway. But we often, have either existing staff or staff that we hire on a short-term basis to be able to complete this. I think part of the rest of your question is maybe more about the verification process and also how this goes through the green bonds confirmation. Sean?
Let me chime in, John. Once criteria are clear, gone through a consultation process, reviewed by industry working groups, signed off by the Climate Bond Standards Board that I mentioned at the beginning of the call, which is a bit of a tortuous process, I will say, with the benefit of having a very robust outcome. Then it goes out to market for verification. There are a group of approved verifiers globally whose job it is to do that work. That is to confirm that the credentials of a bond being issued under the certification scheme comply with the standard. On our website, you'll find a list of them. There's about a dozen so far. It includes everyone from Occam Research in Europe or Trucost to Sustainalytics to KPMG and EY, DNVGL, Bureau Veritas, so organizations along those lines. It's very important to note that the criteria for whether an asset or project can be included or not are determined by the standard and available as a public good. The role of the verifier is to confirm that the asset or project then complies with that, and also to confirm that the use of proceeds reporting and transparency meets the Climate Bond Standard. Once they provide an assurance report for a prospective issuer, that then gets submitted to the Climate Bond Standard Board, which approves it. Generally rubber stamps it, but does ask questions now and then as far as, especially in this relatively early stages of the scheme, to better understand how to improve the scheme going forward. And that means that when the bond goes to market, it is visibly and publicly backed by the large number of investors represented on the board, the NGOs involved as well. So they've actually signed off on the actual bond. So that's a process that goes forward. And please feel free to follow up with any questions by email, Sean@climatebonds.net, if you'd like to have more information.
Is that a fair answer, Jopa?
Yes. No, to me, the question, because I don't understand the bond market, is that the presentation started with that it is utilities oriented. It's the bond market for utilities, so they get the money, and of course utilities have a water issue, so eventually you come here. Now, looking at the details of what you've been doing, which is very good, I was wondering, what the process is that if a utility applies for money, a bond, and then says I want a green bond, how automatically it will come to this standard, or whether the bond issuer will require this type of information. I will dive into this deeper. I just don't understand yet, for me, not the value of this piece of work, which is good, but to what extent it will actually influence the bond market. That's where I have, I just don't know. I mean, I have to dive deeper into this. So I will look at that.
It's a good question, Job, and we have been told by investors globally who are involved in our various stakeholder groupings that certification is an incredibly useful proxy, particularly in areas where they simply do not have internal due diligence capability. They say they want to invest in green bonds and climate bonds as part of their macro strategy for the organisation, but it's difficult to figure out what complies at the moment. The market is currently in Europe relying on a group of independent verifiers, most of which are also now certifiers, approved verifiers under the climate bond standard, by the way, who are doing bespoke reports. This is an attempt to standardize that and make it simpler and easier for people. Will this actually be a big attraction for a utility? It kind of depends. The reason why issuers say they want to issue a bond is because they get a new group of investors to their investor register. Most treasurers are very keen on that. They, in the words of KfW in Germany, deepen their relationship with investors, or stickiness as it's known in the trade. And sometimes they get a modest price benefit, which is worth the effort, particularly if you're doing a €500 million bond. A few basis points, if you are able to get that benefit, can amount to a fair amount of money. So they're the drivers. It is in an early stage of the market. It's about 70 billion outstanding US dollars worth. However, most bonds are oversubscribed, so there's clear evidence of strong investor demand. And I guess what we're looking at is how that plays out over the coming year. We don't expect all issuers to necessarily find this of value, but if we can make the certification a very useful marketing tool for issuers that are trying to raise capital as a shortcut, a discovery tool for investors, a shortcut to get investors, then indications are it will be valuable and will encourage people to do more. That's certainly the anecdotal feedback from issuers to date. The water area is a new sector. There haven't been many utility bonds yet. The bonds that we've seen have been in the municipal space in the US mainly, and then development bank issuance. So, there's some uncharted waters here, but let's say that the talk is very positive so far. We'll get to see whether it'll really work out, but we're confident enough to warrant doing this exercise.
And this is Monica from Sears. If I could jump in, I think, that there's also the possibility that corporates could issue bonds in this area as well. So I think that is certainly an area of interest that we'd like to see develop. Joppe, I don't know if your questions are in terms of like if it was a corporate issue or like a Nestle or a Unilever, how hard would it be for them to go through this? And Sean, correct me if I'm wrong, but they would very much get guidance from their investment bankers that actually put the bonds to market, and there are these key independent verifiers that kind of walk the issuer through the process. So it's not meant to be too difficult.
Look, that's exactly right. Price points are worth noting here. In the bonds that have been getting certified so far, not under the water criteria, it's generally a pretty low cost of transaction, sort of like US dollars 20 to 25,000 to get a verification. If you're doing a small bond like a 20 million, that's quite a lot of money. If you're doing a larger bond like a 200 million, it's a relatively small change. If we can come out with criteria that are relatively simple to interpret, then we have a chance of keeping the cost of transaction very low, and that makes it easy. But people coming to market for the first time do invariably need a bit of, explanation, hand-holding. At the Climate Bonds Initiative and with our partners like at Ceres, we are absolutely trying to support people to understand the process and get to the first base. The way these markets work is you get a few issuers out first. Once you've got some pioneer issues in a sector like water, it flows, so to speak. And that's what we're expecting to happen here.
Yeah, just to, no, I follow you entirely. I think the only thing what I want to add is that the logic and the structure which you have developed in the standard may also be useful for, I would argue, for non-bond issues. It's a very logical step, and if we can make that clear, then it already helps many corporates just to look at that risk as well and use the standard to assess their risk, not necessarily translating that into a sort of a bond issue, which may be the case. But I think it has value in other areas as well. So that was my only reflection, and since I know that bit a lot better, that's easier for me to understand than the bond market, which I know better.
It's a very good point. If I can just add one last thing, John, is that we are talking with a couple of equity funds about using these criteria in the equity space too, because as you say, at the end of the day, these are simply criteria for, let's call them, quality assets in the context of a climate change filter. And for that reason, yeah, I think you're right. The applicability we certainly hope the applicability will be quite wide to help guide the market, especially if we get volume bond issuance. Then the way these things work is everyone else then follows the dominant model. But look, I'm conscious we're near the end of our time. So, John, we perhaps better just run through any other questions we have before we wrap up.
Other
I would like to ask a question. This is Eric from Arcadis. Can I go ahead?
Please.
Go.
Yeah, okay. I'm still, because it's the first time for me in this meeting. I was doubting what's the scope of the project. So to make it clear, do ecosystem restoration does it need to be part of a project? When I say an example, I'm dealing at this moment with Newcastle City. They're trying to redevelop the city center, and they need to store a lot of water because of a lot of cloudbursts. So they have a lot of losses and damages already. So they need to store water, and we would like to propose them to create some living with water strategy, to create some open waters within the city center, to create a wonderful living environment, to create a better investment climate, investment climate, yes. And is this also because it has not to do with ecosystem restoration? It could be in the urban infrastructure, but well, it's not the main impact. Is this also a project which could apply for a climate bond, for issuing a climate bond or not? Or is this far away from the green bond, too far away?
I wouldn't be surprised if Sean also has something to say on the subject, but it's a very, very good question, Eric, and thank you. As I mentioned at the beginning, I'm an aquatic ecologist. I care very much for ecosystems, and we've had some responses in the past from individuals who said is an ecological restoration or an ecosystem-based adaptation project or some other ecosystem-specific project, is it really relevant to this process? And I would say I'd go back to that photograph that I showed at the beginning of the Hoover Dam, and in the same way that there have been shifts that have occurred in the absolute water supply for that system, for that particular piece of infrastructure, that climate change has also affected the ecosystems within that. So we often, with our restoration processes, we often really need to think about how climate will be shifting in the future, so we can ensure that our restoration efforts are also credible and long-lived. And a second aspect of that is really that we've tried to very much integrate eco-hydrological components within the checklist in particular itself. For instance, with the water allocation questionnaire for thinking about the adaptation plan, it's very critical. Projects that include an explicit environmental allocation system, such as an EFLOS plan, will score much better. And approaches that address ecological vulnerability also score much better. Now, there's also some risks, we think, too, from not running an ecosystem project through this kind of green bond, because there are green bonds that are right in this area that are being offered right now. One of them was a Western European bond offering that came out last year. It was for a transboundary basin, and it had many qualities of the project that are very similar to the one for this North American case study. It had a stormwater sanitary system separation. It had very strong environmental water quality claims that were made. And in fact, unlike the North American utility, the top line message on the first page of the headline on the first page of the memorandum was that this was an ecological adaptation project, and there was no depth to it. There were no both in terms of the rest of the document. There was no reference to climate risks. There was no reference to climate benefits. There was certainly nothing about an adaptation plan, and that went all the way. I reached out to them as well for additional information. And they had a very large kind of public outreach site. No climate references were made there. So from the credibility to environmental work, I think that there's actually a very significant risk in not running through this type of a process. The process itself could potentially become an embarrassment and a liability for ecological restoration work in the future. So, Sean, do you have anything to add to that?
I will. I'll say first, Eric, yes, 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 yes. So the sorts of projects you're looking at, I would expect, and I'm expecting quite a lot in that area, to be looking for certification. It's effectively what's happening in places like DC or San Francisco. Of course, it's happening somewhat controversially in London now, as you know, and I think we would probably say it's relatively unlikely the huge Thames water tunnel would qualify, but I'm out of my area of expertise there. But these kinds of city infrastructure projects are a critical part of the water space. I just reiterate John's proposal. The critical things is, has there actually been a proper adaptation assessment or not? The Massachusetts Water Resources Authority, for example, is planning to widen all the stormwater drains in Boston over time. They do have, from what I understand, but I don't know enough about it, a reasonably robust water adaptation plan. One would expect them to be a candidate to be able to issue a green bond to finance that work, or to include it in the Massachusetts state green bonds that be done as a line item. I'm not quite sure the use of proceeds flows in Massachusetts, but that's an example. So essentially I'm saying yes, 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 if it fits the criteria, and Newcastle would be an obvious candidate. Does that make sense?
Yeah, this is, sorry. Yeah, okay. I'm still on. I thought I was on mute. No, this makes sense. This is clear to me, and I refer to what I explained to you in an early meeting, Sean, the resilience pathway, in which we worked with several cities, and we found out a lot of opportunities to adapt. And sometimes the most cost-effective solution is an ecosystem-based solution. Sometimes it's not, but both might be quite good for climate adaptation, and might be, well, real integral project. So this is what I would like to know, and well, it's clear now. And regarding the adaptation plan, I would say if there has been a good, it's also very important if there has been a good research about cost-effective solutions, and to compare traditional engineered solutions with ecosystem-based solutions. And if it finally appears that the traditional engineered solution is much better, more cost-effective, then it could be preferred, I think. This is my personal vision.
Good, interesting point.
Yeah. I hope for and share your vision, Eric.
Thank you, Eric. I look forward to further communication about all of this. I'm conscious that we're 10 minutes past the hour. We're about an hour from when we actually started. Are there any final questions to wrap us up, or shall we call here? Shall we call it quits here?
And
okay.
If anybody has any follow-on questions, please do reach out to any of us.
Absolutely. Well, John, I'm not getting any on my screen. I don't know whether you're seeing any on your screen.
No, I'm logging off myself up here. Sorry.
So I'm just going to say, on behalf of the consortium, on behalf of Monica and John on the line, thank you so much for joining us today, everyone. This is an ongoing process. Please do send in any comments or questions, and we do hope to be going to public consultation, full public consultation in the near future, but we've still got a few things to tweak, especially in terms of explaining what we're doing. So we need all the help we can get from you to ensure that our communication and possibly our criteria are going to meet the needs of issuers and investors in the sector, let alone domain experts who understand the issues. Please help us here. Thank you again, and thank you especially for John for all the hard work you've done over the last year to get us to where we are now. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.